So we're going to allow as much time as we can for this presentation. Jason and Jeff have put together for us. Don't have a lot of introduction other than Jason Powell and Jeff Hukill with EGLE Remediation Redevelopment Division, and this is related to the former SD Warren Sappi property. And just kind of a statement, I'm sure they'll make it, but this is really at the water's edge upland. I think that's the information we're dealing with today rather than anything that's offshore or bottom sediments. But we'll let you guys go ahead and run with the presentation. Then we'll try to hold our questions till the end rather than interrupting them in the midst of it.
Yeah, thanks, Dennis. So I'm going to attempt to, with my limited knowledge of Teams here, share the appropriate screen and get going. And then hopefully you guys can now see my presentation here and maybe see me in a little thumbnail too. So I'll stay on here. But well, thanks first off for inviting us to speak to your organization here. It's nice to be able to have the opportunity to be heard and kind of get some information out there. It's a complicated site that's got a pretty fascinating history out here. So we're going to take you through. I'm going to take you through a lot. So I like to try and teach while I talk. So hopefully, as we go through this presentation, you'll come out of it learning both a little bit about who we are, about the site history, which a lot of you probably know more about the site than I do, and then too a little bit kind of an environmental 101 too when we start talking about things like due care. So kind of an idea of who we are, property history. We'll go through the known environmental contamination out there, like you were talking about, and what we don't know, what we call data gaps, and then also talk a little bit about those due care property owner obligations, and what sort of future steps that we would like to see, and a little bit about some of the. I know that there's been some ideas floating around out there of some ideas, and then development ideas, and then obviously plenty of time for Q&A. And it's nice because I see a lot of familiar names on the call, including some people that I've worked for in the past. So it's pretty cool to be able to reconnect in some digital fashion. There's people out there that I need to reach out to, who you are. We haven't talked in a long time, so good to see you. But you all know EGLE at this point. That's why you invited us out here. But my name is Jay. I'm the Assistant District Supervisor in the Grand Rapids District Office. I'm also the managing of the Remediation Redevelopment Division, and I'm also the managing agency contact here for this SD Warren Sappi property. And I'll let Jeff introduce himself. He's in our brownfield section.
Yeah, thanks, Jay. My name is Jeff Hukill. I'm a brownfield specialist within the Brownfield Assessment and Redevelopment section of the Remediation and Redevelopment Division. And I will serve as the main project contact and coordinator for the remediation grant that's going to be used on the property here.
Yeah, and we'll get into that. That kind of wraps up our presentation there too. So let the money man talk about that right at the end. So, and then Karen Vorst. Sorry, what was that, Jeff?
No, yeah, you're going right where I was going.
Yep, and then Karen Vorst. She's also the Grand Rapids Mediation Redevelopment District Supervisor. She's also on here somewhere. You might see her pop up at the end too if we have any other questions. So we may tag team a little bit at the end. So. Just so that we're clear on expectations here too, I've got a little cartoon that shows what we call the water cycle, and a lot of you have probably seen this in some capacity. I don't know how many scientists we have on the call here, whether they're professional scientists or hobby scientists and concerned citizens. And EGLE and us as people, we care a lot about this water cycle and how it impacts human humans and the wildlife. But in EGLE, we have to specialize to some degree. So we kind of split into a couple different divisions, and I'll just summarize a few in here. Air quality being one, the water resources being another, and they're going to deal with, you know, the surface water bodies and rivers and wetlands. And then we focus here on remediation, redevelopment. Generally, we're looking at the world of soil, groundwater, soil gas, spills that could impact those. And then obviously it's all tied in together. So when we're talking, you know, make sure, at least when you hear me talking, make sure you keep that in mind, that I'm coming from the redevelopment, remediation, redevelopment division's perspective here. And of course, projects like SD Warren, Sappi, they touch on all of these. And so we will, you know, just keep that in mind. But by way of background here, I've got some pretty cool pictures to show you here, but you know, this property actually goes back to the late 1800s. In fact, they started construction on the paper mill back in 1899. But being such a large piece of land, and growing bigger by the, you know, year after year after it was developed out there, you can imagine that they made use of it for a variety of reasons, including sawmill. They did some tanning chemical production. There was a piano manufacturer right along Lakeshore Drive there, cool old building that's now demoed, regretfully. And a lot of that work, that demolition occurred from 2009 to 2017. You all recall some of the transactions that occurred there. In 2016, the state of Michigan entered an administrative order by consent with the liable parties for the contamination. And then right around that same time, Pure Muskegon, who is the current property owner, purchased the site, intending to redevelop it. So that kind of gets us through that, you know, that long history in just one slide. But when we look at some of these old pictures here, I think this is right around 1935. It's a cool aerial oblique view. And let's see if I can get a highlighter. Laser pointer. Yeah, so cool. So like the piano factory was up towards the front of the property. You can see this big enclosure behind a seawall. You can even see a ship back there. And then floating in here are a series of logs. And of course, you've got the paper mill operation in there. This is a little bit zoomed in view of that. Different times, you can tell there's a little bit more going on here in the bay. And a busy time for Muskegon there, lots of growth occurring. From the air, now looking more straight down, not long after that, you start to see the development continue to occur. And we have this enclosure still here along the west. I'm trying to keep these roughly the same scale so that we can kind of flip back and forth. There's a bit of a flip book, you know, so to speak, as things change. But we've got what they call the coal slip, which is a large dock where they could bring barges in, ships in, and unload them here. You start to see the lime settling. See some of their wastewater in the central portion of the site into a settling lagoon that then goes off into Muskegon Lake, and then some filling has occurred over here. This red dashed line is a very, very rough approximation of where the natural shoreline of Muskegon Lake existed prior to this building. You saw in my previous slide there that currently the property encompasses about 123 acres, and they managed to turn that 80 acres addition to what it was naturally from basically the railroad tracks north. Let's jump a little bit forward here to 1955, and you can see obviously quite a bit more filling has occurred. This was what we refer to as the coal slip in more recent days, and this area here winds up becoming the surge basin later on. But here's our huge lime pile. We have a coal in this portion of the site, main factory down here to the south. In this sinuous canal that wraps back and forth along the eastern portion, excuse me, of the property, and then around over here, and cooling and settling occurred out there. And then that that plume that goes down into Muskegon Lake is obviously not something that we get excited about now, or are pleased to see. Obviously, we do get excited to see something like that these days. We try to avoid that, of course. Right around the time just before they shut down, 2004, we see again our lime pile over here to the west. We've got some wood chip receiving coal on the north with their wastewater treatment facility. This is their surge basin, which we'll see on a map. Again, that sinuous canal has been closed off. It's no longer in use because of the wastewater treatment facility. And then this corner, the extreme northeastern corner, if I go back, see how this wasn't filled in yet, but from 1955, the last half of that century, this did get filled in. So again, just for reference, here's our here's our rough historical shoreline there. So a lot of man-made, we would consider man-made land, and that's a lot of what we're dealing with here as far as the potential environmental, or all these environmental contaminants that we're dealing with, and potential sources for ongoing concern. Here's a nice summary picture that was provided based on a 2021 air photo, where we've got these areas of concern kind of spelled out: the former canal, fill area, the rough historic shoreline boundary there with the factory property, surge basin, coal storage, and so forth. So this kind of gets us to kind of roughly what the present day property configuration looks like. So in more recent years, as we had mentioned before, Pure Muskegon, once they took ownership of the property there, they did significant investigation activities in support of their due care obligations and potential redevelopment out there. And again, we'll come back to due care here in the last third of this presentation, just so you understand what that is more. Obviously, we discovered PFAS in the subsurface, along with some other chemicals. And they did install and operate a groundwater pump and treat system out there. And that was quite effective for a period of time that it operated there. From 2020 to present, as that treatment system went offline, they cleaned out, backfilled basins or lagoons that were present on site there as part of that treatment system. The property is completely vacant and locked out to prevent people from getting on site there. And there is a prospective purchaser that has been doing some ongoing investigation activities, both soil gas, groundwater, surface water, and some on-site sediment sampling out there. So I'll show you a map here in a second, but what you'll see is the groundwater flow at the property is outward from the upland portions, as Dennis mentioned, to the shoreline, mainly in a northern direction. But along the western fringes, there are areas of the site that do have a more westward groundwater flow. The contaminants of concern, hydrogen sulfide, methane gas in the subsurface. A lot of us are aware too of the metals: arsenic, lead, chromium, manganese. There are some volatile and semi-volatile organic compounds out there. That's to be expected. The site did have some petroleum tanks and generators and so forth in support of their ongoing operations out there at the time. Elevated pH from the lime operations on the western side of the site, and some of that still exists. Some of that lime is still present below the top of the aquifer over there, and that's contributing to elevated pH along that side. There are a few areas that exhibit dioxins. The highest concentrations, thankfully, are at lower depths in the soil out there versus near the surface. And I think one of the most acute concerns that we're looking at here is explosive concentrations of methane gas detected throughout the site, really, but it's especially high in the northeastern portion of the property, where they observed 62.2% methane there. And just for reference there, the action level for the state here is 1.5%, because that's a a fraction that's 20% of the lower explosive limits, or 25%. So clearly that's an acute concern that we're worried about out there. So again, PFAS. We have pretty high concentrations of PFAS out there. You'll note that I called out the maximum concentration of PFOS, and clearly we've got PFOS's drinking water criteria is 16 parts per trillion, and 11 to 12 parts per trillion to surface water, GSI. And so these are orders of magnitude higher than those concentrations there. So as I mentioned earlier, Pure Muskegon spent some money out there, and they managed to remediate or treat 74.7 million gallons and remove some PFAS out there, but that system was taken offline because it was found to be that style treatment was found to be hard to maintain due to some fouling that occurred in the pump and treat system. So, but it did act to reduce the concentrations of PFAS in some areas of the site, but significant PFAS contamination does remain out there. This is a map of the site again from overhead view, showing the direction of groundwater flow. And what we like to say is groundwater flow contours are like topographic contours. So groundwater is flowing from higher levels to lower levels. So imagine this 586 here in the southern portion of the site is higher, and that's feet of elevation is higher than 580.7, and then of course slightly higher than what it is in Muskegon Lake, depending on the season. And so groundwater from up here is flowing this direction. That's those arrows are indicating on the map. And then over here towards the north, over here more towards the west. So you see why I say it's kind of working its way radially outward, but mostly towards the north out there. And this particular map here also shows a handful of monitoring wells that were out there at the time. I call this my spaghetti map because we talked to a little bit about there being lots of contaminants of concern. So this particular map was drawn to call out a couple of the plumes, and really this goes with this goes right in line with those areas of concern that we had talked about there. So this kind of orangish colored line here, this represents the concentration or pH of 9 or greater being inside of here. The purple is some sulfates. PFAS is this wider, I guess, call it fuchsia. I don't know. I'm not the color naming. I could never work for a Crayola. I can give you general colors, you know what I mean? But when we start to fine tune them, that's where you lose me. But and we had some sulfides, and of course this area here shows some methane. A lot of work has been done since 2019 to understand the methane. But and you'll notice here too, as we go from the upland portion, the native natural shoreline to the north in this man-made land, that's where we start to see really the accumulation of these contaminants of concern due to just the variety of materials that are buried and used for fill out there. Sediments and waste materials that remain out there from the old wastewater treatment processes, the lime pile, the coal. There's still quite a bit of coal up in this northwestern portion in the subsurface, and that's contributing to some of those metals. Metals aren't even shown on this particular map in the soils. So. This too is another early map that kind of depicted the exceedance of, I think this one is PFOS. Yeah, this is PFOS here, and these circled wells are ones that exceed the GSI, groundwater surface water interface criteria for us. See that groundwater was sampled at various depths in the aquifer. So many of these, we call them nested monitoring wells, and they're screens set at different depths. In this case, they've been generalized to be shallow, intermediate, and deep. And what we see here is generally higher concentrations of PFAS in the shallow and intermediate zone, and then much less lower concentrations of PFOS in the deeper portions of the aquifer. And that makes sense with that hydrogeology. Again, water is generally being carried northward out regretfully towards Muskegon Lake, which does work to prevent it from being driven deeper into the aquifer. All right.
Isn't this from you?
Here's another heat map that summarizes, in this case, PFOA in the groundwater around about April 2022 sampling event. And again, the concentration in this case here that we're really concerned about is this kind of light brownish color, tan color, 170 or greater. So basically that would correspond with our groundwater surface water interface, 170. So basically this entire interface from over here on the east side, somewhere between MW2 and TW temporary well 3, and then somewhere over here between the surge basin and MW4, we have concentrations of PFOA going into Muskegon Lake above that water surface water interface. Dialing it in here, here's PFOS. PFOS, we're talking again 12 parts per trillion here, and again this very broad area of the site exhibiting concentrations of PFOS in the groundwater, including and up to the northern shoreline there. And then on top of this, I'll just overlay a total PFAS concentrations map here. And again, we can't compare the total PFAS to these numbers at the bottom, but you'll see that that is definitely a pretty gnarly looking blob in that central portion. And it seems to be really focused around, the historic, those kind of white chalky colored lagoons in the sinuous canal in the northeastern corner. So clearly that sediment, those contaminated sediments and soils, materials buried underneath the ground here are contributing to this this broad area of contamination. So what's happened since 2020? We had the pump and treat system taken down. They did, like I mentioned earlier, do some surface water and sediment sampling. Recently, we haven't even had a chance to fully digest it. They did send us a report that was submitted of some sampling that they had done of the surge, what we call the surge basin. That's that central enclosed pond on the northern portion of the property. They did additional groundwater sampling. They did sample the soil gas in several locations. And they also collected some what we call headspace soil gas samples from inside existing monitoring wells to get screening to better understand what sort of vapors are coming off from the groundwater in those areas. And they did, as I mentioned previously, they removed and restored just the PFAS treatment lagoons, which were more towards the yeah. When I say somebody pointed out when I say who, that's who is they, and in this case here it's a combination of Pure Muskegon, the property owner, and also a prospective developer. So that's who's done a lot of this additional sampling out there. And this map here, this summarizes. I just wanted to show that we do, though we still have some data gaps, the number of dots you'll see is increased significantly since the 2019-2020 map that I showed earlier, and between the new developer and the current owner, or not the new developer, but a prospective developer, I should say, and the current owner, they are working to continue their knowledge and understanding of what's going on at this property. So that's what this slide is here. So, but as I said, we do have some data gaps out there. More information is needed. We call it characterization. Is kind of the big term that we use in the environmental world. Like we're trying to characterize what is the nature and extent of the contamination that we see out there. Do we have all of the contaminants identified? Do we know where it is on the property? How deep does it go? What vertical intervals in the unsaturated portion of the soil where this contamination is? Are there portions of the soil where eventually people could touch contamination? Direct contact is a concern. And then and do we really know what is causing those explosive levels of methane, for example, and where on the property that is to kind of drive what potential developments might occur out there. We don't understand this enough to really kind of develop a good plan to understand the feasibility of mitigating. And mitigation is that lessen the effects of or prevent exposure to these different potential exposure pathways. Again, preventing direct contact, for example, can be as simple as capping a surface, putting a protective cap on the surface of the soil. But in so doing, you can also prevent methane from just naturally off-gassing and accumulating under whatever that cap might be. So I think something too here with everybody on the call that's very concerned about Muskegon Lake is this idea of capturing contaminated groundwater before it migrates into Muskegon Lake. And what does that look like? Can it be done effectively, cost effectively, and in the long term? Because this is going to be a long-term commitment to cleaning up this property and again cleaning up, remediating it there. So and then of course better understanding the short and long-term effects that the contamination at the property has on Muskegon Lake. Flux is kind of that term that we use for the transition from one media into the other, from the soil and groundwater into the lake and the sediments out there. Getting a better understanding about what that flux is, what that rate is, and what sort of impacts that might have on the lake there. And of course, our focus is on due care, and that's preventing someone from receiving harm from the contamination there. So any redevelopment that needs to occur out there has got to be protective of the public health. And that could, for whatever the use is, whether it's residential or non-residential. So I threw around the term due care. So this is where I kind of transition I'd like to transition the presentation into a little bit of environmental 101 for you. And I'm sorry, I'll start this section out with a Google-based US legal definition here. But the key for us to note here is due care being that effort made by a person or an entity to avoid harm to another. And so apparently I said something my phone wanted to answer. That's interesting. So I like to use the analogy of making sure your dog is on a leash when you take it to the park, or when we put up railings at high places or along stairways. Leashes are a mitigation, are a type of due care where we're trying to help prevent potential harm to the dog, traffic, or to people, or prevent harm to people from edges, like so they don't fall off or have support when they're going down the stairs or whatever. And sometimes like ordinances may compel us to have certain types of due care. Like I said, the railings is a good example. And our cleanup program in Part 201, Part 213, they're broadly based on this premise here, is avoiding harm to one another there. So who has due care obligations? And in Part 201 is the part of Michigan law that regulates environmentally contaminated properties. In Part 201 simply states a person who owns or operates. And again, the key is the owner or operator. They have that due care obligation. So in 2016, when Pure Muskegon took the property over, one of the focuses of the administrative order by consent was to make sure that they had done their done the work that they needed to do to assure that their due care obligations were being met. And the key out here too is one of the keys in this statement here is all hazardous substances at the property. So that's where we step into that that characterization element there. I'm calling this here the 6 pillars of due care, and these pillars are letters in the statute basically, but preventing exacerbation, again, mitigating those unacceptable exposures, and those are fancy words for basically making sure that people aren't exposed to the contamination at concentrations above our cleanup criteria based on the uses. Taking reasonable precautions against foreseeable acts or omissions of a third party. Fencing, for example, is a good way to make sure, if it's working properly, that people don't go on the property and may accidentally be exposed to contamination out there. And of course, providing cooperation assistance and access for any response activities that a liable party or the state, whoever might need to get out there to assess the contamination. And complying with any land or resource use restrictions. You'll hear the term restrictive covenant. Those are administrative tools that are filed on a deed that basically tells future people what they may or may not do on a property. And of course, if they, an owner operator may not impede the effectiveness of any land or the resource use restriction out there. So, a new owner couldn't come in and tear up a cap, for example, if we were capping contamination out there. So under Part 2, and a lot of what we do in remediation redevelopment division here is actually spent on B, that mitigating unacceptable exposures, or better yet, I'd love to see remediation, mitigation, that preventing or lessening the effects of something bad. But remediation is always remediation is our first name. So that is one thing we'd like to see on there. So and then the key here too is under the Part 10, we call them the Part 10 rules. They also have to maintain documentation that demonstrates what they've done, and that's the comprehensive understanding of all those potential exposure pathways, what concentrations occur, if any unacceptable exposures could occur, what they've done to mitigate, and then of course the ongoing maintenance, maintaining the documentation and any notices that are required under by rule here too. So that's the sort of documentation that EGLE can request to from a owner operator. So what the heck is an exposure pathway evaluation? Here on our journey of Environmental 101, we'll talk about an exposure pathway as well. Simply put, it's kind of that route that contamination could take from its source to a receptor. And this becomes relevant out here because these things change over the course of a property's life cycle. Already you've seen pictures in this presentation where we went from a relatively, a smallish site. It got really huge, developed up, it was cleared out. Things changed out there significantly, and that changes this sort root receptor pathway here. So the key exposure pathways that we look at out here are, of course, drinking water. I mean, who didn't drink out of the hose? But regardless of that, that's like one of the cutest kids ever. Kind of love that picture there. That groundwater surface water interface is a big one. Volatilization indoor air pathway. And again, that's indoor air. So if we don't have buildings, we don't have indoor air. And so that's one thing that has changed significantly out here at the site as it's been demolished. Direct contact, coming into contact with soils that might have contaminants at concentrations above our limits. Of particular concern, no pun intended, would be the particulate soil inhalation. That's that potential for wind-blown dust, and the volatilization to ambient air. There are some sites, and in this particular case, I haven't seen data to suggest that either the particulate soil inhalation or the volatilization to ambient air criteria have been exceeded, thankfully. But there are some sites, including some right here in West Michigan, that have had to be remediated because they have had chemicals in the near surface that may volatilize at a concentration to the ambient air that could present some level of unacceptable exposure to a person at the property. And of course, out here too, the flammability and explosivity concern too, with the concentrations of methane out there. So this exposure pathway evaluation kind of takes us through that study. Again, that source route and receptor thing there. So I like to use the analogy here of a highway. And in this case here, you know, the source of exposure here would be obviously the road. The environmental media, let's say it's cars. The point of exposure would be in that roadway there somewhere, probably on the paved surface. That's also our point, our route. And then our receptor population, thankfully in this case, you know, you and I aren't standing in the middle of this road, but because we don't have a source that source out there, there's no cars in this particular highway, which this just looks like a heavenly scene to me. I love, it looks like somewhere out west. I love it out west. So this looks great. Compare that to this stock photo that I found online somewhere. This has lots of sources of potential exposure here. We've got our media transport mechanism. And where mitigation comes in here, if I'm a person standing kind of over here in this grassy strip, I'm being protected, hopefully, from exposure to this contamination, both by not being in this route of exposure, not in the roadway, but I also have some due care in the form of these guardrails here to hopefully keep the cars in the car space, and not that this is really a people space, but the people in the people space. And that's where this exposure pathway evaluation comes in. And I'm giving you this kind of fundamental education, you know, in environmental 101 here, because again, this idea of due care is what we're especially concerned about here. Again, these concerns change based on use and access to the property. So, you know, what happens out here is we're watching, monitoring it very closely, because again, without structures, vapor intrusion is not a concern. But as structures come in, we need to make sure we're really assessing the potential risks involved out there. I want to mention too here that an owner operator or others can submit what we call a response activity plan, as well as some other options that they have for EGLE review, but they're not required to do this under Part 201. The way Part 201, our environmental law, is written, is they have activities that they can voluntarily undertake. I think there's an alternate way to put that, which I can't think of it off the top of my head right now, but they can proceed and do work out there. Again, we can't stop them from doing work. In fact, we want to see good work being done. They can also send us these plans to review, and we will speak to response activity plans to their self-implementation. Thank you, Peanut Gallery. See, it's good that I have little pop-ups on my notes. So the self-implementation of Part 2.1. Thank you, Karen. Or is that Carrie? No, sorry, that's Carrie. Yes, thank you. So the so far we've seen some data. You've seen evidence here in the presentation that we've had data given to us, but we have not approved any response activity plans to date. And one of the main things that we look for in response activity plans is going to be that holistic evaluation of both site characterization and planning to obtain the data that's necessary to really see the big picture. we like to see plans that don't ignore exposure pathways. Again, we talked about those potential exposure pathways. We want to make sure that plans that come to us have an effort to assess all those potential exposure pathways. So far that's we've got a lot of potential ideas that have been floated by, but nothing firm to date. So on the plus side here is we do have some grant funds, and I'll get Jeff queued up here, but we do have some grant funds to start to assist with some of this assessment and site investigation here, as well as cleanup and removal, that R word, that remediation. So Jeff, you want to take it away? I'm going to take a sip of coffee here when you go.
Sure. Thank you. So as Jay just pointed out, this site has a lot of issues. There's vast contaminants, and the site is very, very large. So in 2022, the Michigan legislature recognized that this site has a lot of concerns that wouldn't be addressed without some assistance. So they allocated $15 million to fund PFAS remediation activities. So everything was going to be used to address PFAS at the property. Fast forward a couple years, we have more data. We see that there's a lot more contaminants there than just PFAS. And to help get development up and running, there's a lot of other environmental issues that needed to be addressed. So as a result, the legislature just recently amended the funding legislation to allow for non-PFAS contaminants to be addressed with the funds. So it's more of a development grant. It can, we'll go over in a second here what it can do, but the scope of the funding has changed from just PFAS to, any of the contaminants that Jay mentioned can be addressed with the funding. The funding does go to Muskegon County, so the funds do not go to private parties. So the county is the local contact, and they are the ones that submit the plans, and they make sure that the things that are going to happen on the property are something that they support. So we want that local support element. The process essentially to make sure that things are protective of public health is the county working with the developer and consultants, environmental professionals, will submit a detailed work plan to EGLE, to Jay and I to review, and others, depending on what the contents are, that explain what the activities that are proposed for the site, what they're going to address, where they're going to be done on the property, how much they're going to cost, why they're necessary, and so forth. So we ask for some detailed information as to what they're going to do. And then Jay and I would review that plan to make sure that the activities are going to be protective of public health. And then we can give the approval to proceed with those activities, or we can have a conversation and we can talk back and forth saying, we're not sure about this. We need some more information here and there. Can you provide some clarification on some things? So we have this iterative back and forth process until we are satisfied that the activities are going to be protective of public health. We give it the thumbs up, and then work can start. And as Jay noted, we only have control and approval over grant funded activities. But as Jay showed, there's a lot of issues at the site that are going to exceed the financial capacity of this grant. There's more than $15 million worth of work to do out there. So if a developer chooses to, implement some remediation activities on their own, we would not have a review and approval process unless they submitted that formal response activity plan that Jay outlined. So as of right now, we have kind of a review and approval of grant funded activities. And to date, Jay had mentioned what we've kind of already done. We've spent about $720,000 of the $15 million, and we've done quite a bit of sampling. There needs to be more done to characterize the site. And we've also done, there were some settling basins where they did some experimental work to neutralize PFAS. Those basins had to be cleaned out and the contaminated soil removed. And so those are the two activities we've done to date. So there's really no activities going on at the site at the moment that are grant funded. We'll probably have some more investigation down the road, but this will be kind of tied into the redevelopment of the site. So as the redevelopment phase starts to kick in, then we'll see some more requests to use the grant funding. Do you want to go to the next slide, Jay, please?
Yep.
So these are the types of activities that have been identified in the legislation as being eligible for use with the grant funds. So we have investigation, excavation, transportation. So basically getting the contaminated soil off-site, digging that up and getting that out of there, treating contaminated groundwater. That can be, capturing that in a frac tank and then hauling it off-site. The legislation does also mention drinking water, addressing drinking water. So we've agreed to assist with running a water supply from Lakeshore Drive onto the center of the property. So that'll be part of the development. Remedial actions are essentially activities that are going to either neutralize or remove contaminants. So if there was an identified source of contamination, if we can go dig that up and get it out of there, that would be considered a remedial action. Jay has alluded to due care a lot. The common types of due care activities that we see requests for grant funding for would be things like putting a soil cover over direct contact. If there's metals in the ground that exceed direct contact criteria, we can put a clean layer of soil over top of that will prevent exposure to that. So that's the due care part of that activity. Another common one is a vapor mitigation system installed underneath a building to make sure that those vapors that are moving up through the soil don't enter a structure and cause a risk to people inside. The removal of underground storage tanks. So if we find tanks out there, we can get those out of there. Contingency funds are basically for unknowns. This site's going to have a lot of unknowns. So things you don't necessarily plan for, we can address if they're still eligible with grant funds. And then administrative costs, reporting and that kind of stuff. So that's in a nutshell what the $15 million is kind of earmarked for at this point in time. And that's really all I've got. So very brief. I think we're on to questions.
That does bring us to our questions section there. And I'm happy to flip back to any slides that you might be interested in seeing. Maybe I'll pull up just a general overview slide of the site for the sake of our conversation. I can also stop sharing to allow us to look face to face too, as questions might pop up.
I think there's a lot of there's some questions in the chat. It looks like it might take a sec to sift through here.
While you're reading through those that are on the chat, I think some of them that were coming up seem to be addressing the concern for the PFAS. It was a pretty big balloon you had drawn on the map, and the groundwater surface water interface, I think, is of a major concern to us and some of these that are in attendance on this section. If it's entering the lake now, is it what can be done, or are you making any recommendations?
Well, we're not making any recommendations at this time. At this point here, our focuses have been mainly on the acute risks at the property. Obviously, something needs to be done out here, but currently, the PFAS, which has received some pretty good attention so far, to be determined.
Yeah, and this is Karen. I'd just like to add on to that as part of some of these efforts that are going on the site by the current owner or future owner, we're hoping that the remediation and source removal, source control of some of the other contaminants will also kind of quote double dip and also help with the PFAS as well. There has been some limited surface water sampling and fish testing done in Muskegon Lake that is on our MPART website and Department of Health and Human Services. So there is some data on water quality out there. There has not been done a specific GSI study that actually measures the pore water along the side of this property to see exactly what the concentrations are that are venting in. That's a potential in the future, but right now we're kind of in a spot like we are on many sites across the state where we have GSI concerns at some of these historic orphan sites. So unfortunately, this is unfortunately not just here at this lake, we have concerns, but at many sites across the state, we're trying to prioritize and get funding to address.
Yeah, thank you, Karen. Yeah.
There was one question about kind of what's the definition of explosivity? That was
Yeah, thanks.
early
Thanks,
on.
Jeff. Yeah, I saw that and I was going to hit that one too. Yeah, so without getting too complicated, but there's an idea, the concept is there's a certain concentration where methane, when it's mixed with oxygen in the atmosphere, can ignite, which we call the lower explosive limit. And then you can actually have so much that it gets above the upper explosive limit, which we have out here in certain areas, where we actually have more methane than oxygen, you know, and chemistry magic happens, and it doesn't want to explode. But along the fringes there, what we can't control is where that mixing of oxygen and stuff goes. So pretty much that lower explosive limit, in fact, 20% of that, 25% of that lower explosive limit is actually where we start to get concerned. So 5%, again, is what we consider explosive. That's our lower explosive limit, or LEL, fancy term there. So yeah, good. Question.
I see the question.
I share the disappointment about the amount of pollution that has gone into the lake for decades. That is a sad truth.
Charles asked about who's the custodian of the grant money. So EGLE has, EGLE controls the use of the grant funds, but they are awarded to Muskegon County. And so I work directly with the county to make sure that those funds are used appropriately. Am I missing anything in the chat?
Yeah, there's a question from Katrina. She wanted clarity if the developer does still have to send in a plan to EGLE for further mitigation before development can begin.
Yeah, I missed that one. Thanks, Karen. They don't have to. No. We want them to. We hope they will. And at a certain point, it behooves them to send in a comprehensive plan to us, because obviously we're going to be very concerned about that due care element. And we need to make sure that they've looked at everything that we're going to be looking at. And so, yes, that plan does not have to be, but it really should be. And that's the sort of, that's our opportunity to make sure that they're looking at things the way they need to be.
And just to expand a little bit on that, if grant funds are used for pre-development activities, then yes, we would review and approve those.
For the grant, yeah.
Correct. So it kind of depends on who's paying for the activities.
Yeah.
I think that's all I see in the chat. Is there, let's see. Hold
do
on.
you can
there's a question about source of the methane on site.
Yeah.
Oh, good. Well, there are many sources. So again, without getting too science nerdy on you, but when you have organic materials, for example, and certain chemicals, here, let me actually switch to a older slide that I'll put my spaghetti map up here. Fishbeck spaghetti map, I should say. But when organic materials are placed underground, like in landfills, for example, and they don't have enough oxygen, the naturally occurring bacteria that exist to break those chemicals down, they use up any available oxygen. And as part of this process of breaking these organic materials down, I mean, it can be things like swamps have methane, for example, because you're breaking down organic matter. When you break down different sugars, wood, wood chips, pulp, anything organic, gas, oil, pretty much anything with chains of carbon and hydrogen, these bacteria will consume that, and they use up all of the free oxygen that's out there, and then they'll start to scavenge for any other sources of oxygen that they can find, and regretfully that turns into a byproduct of that is CH4 methane. So again, yes, capping that will make that worse, because not only are you preventing any natural oxygen from getting down there to feed those bacteria, but you're also capping you're allowing the concentrations of methane to increase. Similar to natural gas accumulation. Again, I'm a geologist, so natural gas accumulation in deep underground reservoirs. So it's all from the organic breakdown of organic material, the natural breakdown of organic material.
Okay.
I see one of the questions that's been brought up in the chat is whether you had any offshore sediment sampling, but I don't believe you're including any of that in this.
Right. There has been some done that out there, and that wasn't part of this presentation. Yeah.
Okay.
There was a question about the difference of due care with the current owner as opposed to the liable party. What responsibilities did they have? And so my understanding from a city commission meeting is that the original owner would have had to do remediation that is then more remediation than what is required of the new owner. Also, will monitoring continue after remediation?
Well, the owner operator's obligations are actually to mitigate unacceptable exposures in those 6 pillars of due care. So as frequently happens, remediation isn't the primary driver for due care obligations. It is managing potential risks. So in that case, a liable party would have indeed more obligations towards that remediation. We do exist in a risk-based corrective action program where we look at cleanup criteria based upon formulas that set these cleanup criteria. So that's where these numbers start to play and the different responsibilities. So due care, again, we want to see some remediation occur out there. There has been some funds set aside for that. That would be fantastic. And maybe it is possible too that the most effective way to mitigate a potential concern is through remediation. And that's where a feasibility study, again, sufficient characterization, understand the scope, the nature and extent, and then a feasibility study to look at the cost associated with, well, is remediating it feasible? If so, is it cheaper than trying to mitigate this?
Okay, thanks, Jay. There's also, just going down the list here, if there is no particular developer interest, what is the minimum due care by the state of Michigan, waters of the state?
Yeah, well, so again, the owner operator has obligations for due care, so not the state. And then so from due care's perspective, the part 2's perspective, the due care is a human health exposure risk based thing. So if we were to say, for example, observe that concentrations of pH in the surface water nearby were dangerous to swimmers, that's where due care would kick in. Or if in some examples too, we have sites where there may be non-aqueous phase liquids, like free petroleum products or high concentrations of ammonia dissolved in the ground, where that could actually vent into a surface water body and present human health exposure. So due care is dealing specifically with public health, human health, direct risks there. From again, I'm not a biologist here, so from a standpoint of the aquatic life, species of life and the plants, that's a whole nother area that we would get into that I'm not an expert on. So
Jay, I hate to keep bringing it back to it, but isn't a part of that due care keeping it from that groundwater surface water interface? I mean, entering Muskegon Lake. our drinking water in Muskegon County comes from just around the corner outside of the channel. And so I think part of that due care provision is preventing ongoing contamination of our groundwater, or at least our surface water.
I can definitely see that argument. So far, we haven't seen that to be the case based on the testing of the, of that intake there, and so, but yeah, I hear that point. I definitely hear it
And
loud and
just,
clear.
yeah, and a lot of this is function on based how 201 is currently in place, worded, right? What we can and can't have current owners do in regards to that. You'll hear a lot of kind of buzz out there right now, polluter pay bills, different amendments that are potentially being thrown around to update Part 201. I think these are good conversations to be having at groups like this, especially letting your local representatives and legislators know concerns about that. Because as someone was bringing up with taxpayer money and things like that, we are limited in kind of, we're almost at the mercy on a lot of our sites of the finding viable, liable parties. If they are no longer around, they become orphan sites, and it does then become the burden of the state to try to address them with, that's right, taxpayer dollars. So I just want to bring that up. That is something that is on the street. Be informed on that and reach out to your local representatives about concerns with that.
I guess on that same line of thinking, when you have a known entity, which I believe still does exist, that operated this facility for many years, is there any going back to the original polluter?
I would have to talk with our attorney general on that. Us on the call, we were not around managing this site during this time. I know they were required to do some, that said administrative order of consent. So yeah, I wouldn't want to spread any misinformation on that, but we can follow up on that for you.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Marilee is asking, how long would complete cleanup take before this property can be developed? You know,
Complete cleanup. Yeah, that's too hard to theorize. Somebody had mentioned too, what's to prevent something from happening like Petoskey, where they built a housing development over closed cement plant. Commonly developments occur on contaminated properties, and in fact, it happens all the time, and that's generally a good thing. But again, the main concern here is, the due care, that mitigation of unacceptable exposures. So yeah. Uh, what was the question again, Jeff?
it was how long would complete cleanup take before the property can be developed?
Yeah, so complete cleanup, again, that's relative to the exposure pathways, right? That's relative to the, never be completely cleaned up. That is, that's not part of, it's not technically feasible, for one. Now if we were to talk about different methods of remediating, we could pump and treat, remediate PFAS for probably decades. And that would significantly reduce the concentrations of those chemicals in the subsurface. So that's what the whole brownfields concept is: a brownfield, a blighted, perceived or actually contaminated property, and trying to work to clean them up or mitigate them to bring them back into productive use. And that's got a lot of definitions.
We've got a lot of questions piling up here, so maybe we can expedite this a little bit. What would it take to cause an explosion on the site?
Just like in your car, right? You need fuel, the oxygen, and the source of heat. So in this case, since there are no structures, there's nothing accumulating these concentrations of methane above ground. And so the air just blows the methane away. So underground activities that could accumulate or allow the accumulation of methane. I'm speaking in very general science, general terms here, not site-specific terms. Those are the sorts of activities we'd want to protect against for those explosivity concerns. Yeah.
It says, is there any consideration given to including sites like this into a racer trust-like remediation program, or is this already a reality?
I can take that one. The Racer Trust was created as part of the requirements for former General Motors Corporation before their 2009 bankruptcy. So they had to set aside money as part of that bankruptcy to address, I think it was 83 locations in 14 states. So that's part being paid for by GM and the money that was set aside for that.
Does this site meet the criteria of a super fund?
I don't, this hasn't been scored by our super fund, division, so I wouldn't be able to answer that.
There's a comment. So taxpayer funds were used to clean up the site. The company that polluted the site is off the hook? Question mark.
I think we kind of discussed that one earlier.
Yeah. If there are known contaminants potentially impacting the immediate water body, what is the testing plan going forward? Swimming, fishing, and recreation is a common use of the public water.
Mhm.
It is, yeah, and that's where you'd have to engage the water quality, water resources division. But
There is the Eat Safe Fish Guide. So these fish here have been tested for PFAS. The drivers for the Eat Safe Fish consumption limits are mostly PCBs and some metals, just based on other industry in the area. We can share a link to that Eat Safe Fish Guide so folks can know how to find that too. But yeah, if there's other public health questions, we can try to get you to those folks who specifically deal with that.
That looks like a lot of the other stuff are comments. I'm not, okay, here we go. Who would ultimately be responsible for health issues caused by exposure?
So no, we would have to ask probably some attorneys that question.
I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat unless I missed something.
There are disclosure laws. Someone's asking about laws that require home developers to reveal the past contamination to potential buyers who may not be aware. Yes, there's Michigan law requires that information to be disclosed. And it's also part of due care obligations as well, that notification. Right, Jay?
Yep. Especially to people who could be exposed to that contamination, utility workers, construction workers.
Yep.
Well, I want to thank you for the presentation. It's been a lot of information to digest. I know this has been put together by a lot of different private parties as well as governmental agencies to do all this testing and gathering of info, trying to characterize the site. And I think, as you said in the beginning, Jay, you have characterized the site, but it still has holes, has spaces that need more information to fully characterize it. Given the prospective purchaser and developer, I'm sure you're plenty aware of the high density residential that's proposed for the site. Any thoughts on, I know you don't want to get into this or the due care or remedial action plan activities, but do you think that plan is feasible with vapor intrusion under the buildings? And I don't know what other suggestions. I don't know how you're going to stop the contaminants from entering the lake, but do you have like a off the cuff comment to make about feasibility?
Yeah, well, we're extremely concerned. We're extremely concerned. We don't, we wouldn't directly fund the the construction of residential homes in areas with known methane. That doesn't mean it can't stop somebody from doing that, beyond those due care requirements. So yeah, we definitely have concerns about that, which we've made very clear, in the past. So yeah, it's a very high bar is what we like to say,
Yeah.
and we'll have to engage many technical experts to even answer that, because again,
Well, that
geologists
will
and
depend on what's remedies and any sort of mitigation that could, or remediation that would be proposed that could affect
right.
kind of the overall site model.
Okay,
Yeah.
yeah, I know there's been a number of proposals out there of how it could be configured, and I remember some of those originally they had canals carved in, and
Mhm.
that became problematic for a lot of reasons. But I think our concern with Muskegon Lake Watershed Partnership is really wanting to make sure the due care provisions are taken care of, that people are protected, because there's a lot of pathways for this existing contamination to make its way into our water or
Exactly.
into our air. And
Yes.
we
Yeah.
just need to really give that a lot of thought.
And just so people know, I think we've kind of skirted around the issue a little bit. The current owner of Pier Muskegon, one of the due care obligations that they've undertaken is they fence off the property. So that preventing that physical access is a due care measure to make sure
Mhm.
people don't come in contact with hazardous materials. So that's an example of due care. And that's, they
Yeah,
maintain that.
and I agree that that's I hate to call them even the potential developer, the Pure Muskegon folks, because I think from the start they were just being a vehicle to get it to where a developer would then take it over, which is fine. If that's their niche and that's where they fit, that's great. So the fence helped them meet their due care provisions for what they're doing, with the exception possibly of what's being released to the lake, to the water body, because I think that falls under it, protecting the public as well. But um, with the forecast for the site being developed in a big way, it requires a whole different level of due care provisions. And because it's gonna, when you do site condos there, you're gonna have to have some deed restrictions which stop people from putting shovels in the dirt. So I think that's our biggest concern, is how do we protect our environment and protect our people.
Yeah, and to add to that too, that deed restriction is a piece of paper, and
Yeah.
you do get scared. That we're very, very conscious of the fact that they are tools in the toolbox, but they're just a means to an end, and that
Right.
won't stop. It doesn't entirely stop. It's like it's law to wear a seatbelt, and that still doesn't stop people from not wearing a seatbelt.
Stupid is as stupid will do, right? They'll just do what they're not supposed to do just because they can.
It looks like there's some more questions that have showed up if we have
Okay.
time here. Are there similar sites you have reviewed that have significantly improved?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
Then you have a mill in Kalamazoo that you went a similar route with, or is that still in a field status?
I know there are things ongoing.
Yeah,
We
there's a
have
lot
many
ongoing.
methane sites too
Mhm.
that are ongoing. And again, that's not in our district, so I don't
Yeah.
know the details specifically about that. But this is one of many. These fill sites too. Muskegon is built upon a lot of fill. And this one here particularly is built out into the lake quite a bit. So reference, there are sites, redevelopment can be done safely, and but it is a based that threshold is based upon that exposure pathway evaluation, and there's a lot of things to consider. The more complex these sites get, this is a very complex environmental hydrogeology for sure. I did want to mention too, we can share the PDF of this PowerPoint presentation too, and so I will pass that back to the organizers here for distribution when that time comes. And Jeff and my email and phone information is on there. You're welcome to reach out to either one of us or both of us to ask more questions.
And Catherine does our social media and outreach, and I know she's looking at posting this presentation on our YouTube channel so that it can be there and accessible for people.
Ooh, can I
that have
monetize it? All right. Yeah, let's get some. No,
questions. I don't think we get that many followers.
no, okay, all right. Yeah. I'll become
Dennis,
YouTube
if I-
famous for all the wrong reasons. Yeah.
If I
There's a
may,
couple, there's, I don't know if we want to keep doing questions or if we come to a point where I know you guys you have some business items to take care of, so it's up to you how we proceed.
I'm good with blowing our other information off till next meeting so that just make sure everybody's questions are answered. And I see Dusty, you have a question or a statement.
yeah, thanks. I was just going to mention that as we intend to post this presentation, there's been mention of some of the fish monitoring, surface water monitoring that's occurred in Muskegon Lake by EGLE Water Division and Department of Human Health Services. That presentation that was given by them to the MLWP is available too. So we've got a recording of that can be shared as well. So through the same avenue. I urge people to watch that as well.
Thank you, Dusty.
There's a question about, can industrial contaminants leach into household water intake pipes?
I would say that's a definitely, I know, an engineering type question. That we're not water engineers, so I think a lot of it has to depend on the age and type of pipe and a lot of chemistry
Chemicals.
properties.
Yep.
Yeah.
David asks, would you leave the approval of residential construction to the city of Muskegon? And then would the city then become liable for problems down the road experienced by residents of dwellings on that site?
Can't speak to
So-
liability things. Like
Yeah.
that.
So the approval process, for residential, that's a locally driven process. We at EGLE don't have any say about approval of development types like that. We get
Right.
involved in specific remedial actions involved in the site through the response activity plan process, but we don't do land use zoning that's a local decision.
Yep.
Would the city become liable for problems down the road?
And that's more of a legal
Yeah, it's illegal.
question.
I do see a question here about Daxon, and again, having recently taken this over, I'm not as completely enthralled in all of the specifics of every chemical out here. I am aware that the higher concentration of dioxin in that northeastern portion was found at a depth of about 6 feet or so. There were some historically some concentrations in the near surface, but there had been some significant earth moving activities. Kathy had mentioned too that there was some lower concentrations observed in sediment offshore from there. I did see some of those concentrations out there, but there, the all more information is needed at this point. There's been quite a bit of material brought into to cover with soil a lot of the old grades, so those old samples are now under additional sand that was moved around on site out there. So the question is, it's in restrictions and remediation required before development. Again, comparing all those exposure pathways and the concentration of every chemical is going to have to be evaluated to demonstrate, that due care is being met, that the site can be safely redeveloped.
I see Leah posted a question there, popped up in chat, that's worthy of bringing out. She's asking, no matter who the developer is or what it's developed for, if we could go after the contamination, who should we appeal to seek funding to really remediate this site?
Well, I know that Senator Bumstead was instrumental in this original $15 million allocation. So, the legislature is where we get the funds for the activities that we, oversee. So that's the only route that I can think of necessarily. I don't know if anyone else has any other thoughts, but
I'll just say there was a group of us a number of years. It was probably been 10 years ago now, maybe a little more. We were concerned with the little site on the north side of town, the Zephyr site,
Mhm.
petroleum refinery site.
Yep.
We paid a visit to Lansing, had this basically the same question we asked at that time, and the answers weren't so good from the district officials at that time. But what we ended up doing was seeking some help from the EPA. We sought some help from the Army Corps of Engineers. It became a concerted effort of a lot of different levels of tax dollars, and it made a huge difference in that
Mhm.
site. At that time, I think it was Senator Hansen, acquired I believe it was a $6 million general appropriation, and he kept insisting that's shovels in the dirt. That's not another study. It's not another characterization. But what I think really paid off was the concerted effort, because we got the EPA to come in and Region 5 pump some cash into getting into an old sprinkler basin, fire protection ditch that had high levels of NAPL and a lot of things that they could go right after and remediate. And Army Corps actually did a lift, laser induced fluorescence on the whole site, which gave a characterization level that had never been acquired on that site. And
Mhm.
like I say, so we kind of brought in everybody we could from every direction. So in answering Leah's question, I think keep in mind what the answer we'd like is something more than just what's at your disposal or Senator Bumstead's disposal. If you have any
And
ideas.
remediation out there is ongoing, at Zephyr, because that EPA had done that initial work, and we spend several $100,000 a year maintaining that, and a couple
Yeah.
$100,000 a year. It's
We're
ongoing
actually,
taxpayer.
yeah, getting ready to do a feasibility study out there to try to assess some kind of newer technologies and trying to get at that remaining NAPL out there. So that's a great
Yeah.
example. I think partnership is really important on larger sites like this. So having those conversations is crucial. And I don't know how many years ago it was that you had those, but it maybe, now could be a good time to kind of restart those.
Yeah, and PFAS and the EPA, they're still developing their
Yep.
their whole thing. So
There's
that
some maybe, yeah, that's a great point, Jay. Huge
Yeah.
changes in their legislation occurring this year yet. That could be beneficial for a lot of our sites.
Kathy, are you aware of anything on the horizon with the EPA that they might allocate some funding for PFAS?
I don't have a solution right at the moment, but I'm glad you brought up the Zephyr oil refinery site, because I think it's a good model for this site too. We may not be able to bring in the same authorities from the Corps of Engineers or EPA because they were specific for certain things, but with the new PFAS rules or environmental kind of remedial technologies that are coming, I can see that being one of maybe a federal partner that we could leverage with state money, So I do think that the Zephyr site is a good model for this one. It's a little different. Zephyr was taken over by the state of Michigan, and they were kind of the responsible party, where that's different. But I think there are a lot of similarities, so we can learn a lot from that. And I'd like to also mention that the comments and some of the questions that are in the chat, if we can capture those, or if you want to send in more, maybe we can do a summary and submit some of our questions and recommendations, comments to EGLE at a later date, and maybe include Water Resources Division in the next round.
Yeah, I would like. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
It's okay. It's Mary with Senator Stabenow's office. I think it would be worthwhile to have, and I can work out with you guys or whatever, reach out to Army Corps because of new language that's been in legislation the Senator worked on. You're getting Army Corps more involved with PFAS issues, right? And so I don't know if it matches up with this particular site, but it's worthwhile asking them and seeing if it makes sense. So if you'd like me to go ahead and do that, I can reach out to them and say like to have
Absolutely.
discussion.
Absolutely. Welcome to any conversations with legislators. Appreciate you being here.
Thank you.
I did want to end on a, kind of a personal note and just say thank you all for your effort in coming alongside of us, because, we are passionate about the environment where I know, I know it's a hard relationship to have when we're dealing with so many different entities and things, and I appreciate your passion for this fantastic resource. I'm an outdoorsman. I love the lake. I've recreated on it. I've fished on it. Love the area. Live out here on the lake shore. And thank you guys for being champions of this cause. And I really appreciate having you guys, I'd like to say, on our team, as we all work together to try and slay this dragon. So
Absolutely.
it's got lots of places. Like we've got it all over. It's a multi-front war. So well, thank you.
Thank you to all of you that were presenting. Like I say, a lot of information to digest, and Jay, you summed it up. We're all on the same team. We're working to the same end. We just need to help each other get there to the finish line, and I believe we will.
Great.
Yes, thank you for having us. We appreciate it.
All right. If there's no other questions at this time, I think we probably hit our 1 minute. 1 minute over. We did well. Well, thank you for everybody for joining us. I appreciate all the questions, the input, the direction from all sides. It's exactly what Muskegon Lake Watershed Partnership is about. We are just a group of people gathered together with the same goal in mind. So thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to meeting again.
Thanks all.
Thank